Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. And now today's host, Chris Lang.
Is there a God? In our human existence, there is no more profound question demanding an answer. The answer results in the most sobering consequences for thought and action. It is imagined by some that belief in a supreme being as the creator and controller of the universe is a mere emotional aspiration, a superstition of ancient times, irrational and illogical, and exploded by modern science. But even though God can't be measured in a test tube, is it reasonable to believe he doesn't actually exist? And if a person chooses to believe, is blind faith all there is? Hi, I'm Chris Lang, and today's topic is intelligent faith. This is part one of a two-part series, and we believe there are many ways to affirm a rational, reasonable faith in the existence of God. In this first part, we'll talk a high-level view, philosophy, science, and historical ways that we can look and examine the evidence to as far as what our faith is really based on. Today, my guests join me via webcam from Newbold College in Bracknell, England, located about 40 miles west of London. Robin Anthony joins us. He's a faculty member at Newbold. He has a master's degree in Reformation history from St. Andrews in Scotland. He's taught English, religion, and communication, and is well-read in many subject areas. Helia Mateus is also joining me here in the studio, and she is doing a license in theology at Newbold College and going to do her master's degree next year. She's from Portugal and presently works with the European Commission. Welcome, both of you, to Hope on Fire today.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
Robin, tell everybody in the audience today what's happening in Europe and England specifically in terms of the worldview towards atheism or the idea of the existence or non-existence of God.
Well, Chris, probably since September 11, 2001, there's been a lot of debate about religion and whether religion is a good thing or not. Is it healthy? And a number of authors, both American and British, have written a number of books that talk about the dangers of religion and why it's just not a good idea. And this isn't just something aimed only at Christianity, it's also aimed at Islam and practically any other religion as well. So we tend to have a very strong atheistic background, I think, in Europe. This doesn't mean that there aren't Christians or we don't have Christians. In fact, a recent poll put a good 70% of the population here in England count themselves as either Christian or believing in God or a mixture of both. But it does mean that at least the press, the media, is very, or tends towards a fair amount of anti-Christian bias.
You know, I noticed Richard Dawkins, a very popular British author and a contemporary atheist, he made a statement that religion in general is not just anti-intellectual, but he says it's the worst evil in the world. You know, I thought about that, Robin, and if that were true, then the former communist Soviet Union would have been like a paradise on earth. I mean, I visited there for several weeks in 1987, and I happened to have a few things in a box that I pulled out. The old Soviet Union was no utopia. This is an old flag that I kept from a box, and I actually got a little army cap from one of the, they had to join the army. Every single one of them had to go into the army, and it has this red star. And I thought, this is what communism ended up with. And having been there, I was followed by Secret Service and cornered by police, and some of my Russian friends were dragged away into the dark. It was kind of a scary place.
Yes.
But so, I mean, that was my first sort of exposure to a system based on atheism. What do you think about sort of the trends and where things are going in terms of morality in the world?
Well, every person is moral, and this is something which often we tend to forget, is that every person acts upon a moral basis. Whether that's a transcendent moral basis or not is another issue. And this, of course, is where a lot of the argument comes down. The very simple, and if I might say, poor Christian arguments will always attack people on the fact that they have no morals. Well, even Richard Dawkins has morals. It's just not necessarily based on the same things that you or I might think about, the idea of a transcendent God, for example. Their morals are based on more materialistic reasons.
Helia, C.S. Lewis was a former atheist and also a famous British author. He made a sort of compared the idea of a law of morality or a law of human nature as one of the greatest evidences for him in the evidence of a God. What did you think about the metaphor that he used of a piano having different keys, and they aren't in and of themselves moral, but the tune that you play has sort of the instinct behind the notes that make it have a sort of a tune? Does that help you in your thought? What do you think about his commentary there?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting idea. First of all, the idea that everyone in each culture, from each race, has a certain moral, universal values which can tell us what is right or wrong. It is indeed a hint, an argument in favor of the existence of God. And that is something that, for us Christians, of course, we're immediately drawn to the idea that we created in the image of God, as Genesis 1:26 tells us. And that, of course, is much more than it's not about us being God, but it's about us being able to relate to God. It's about us being able to have free choice to decide what is right and wrong, to have a self-conscious personality. And of course, that means also that we have something to start off with that is common to all of us, but we also know, and we need revelation to know that human moral as it is has also been marred by the problem of will, the problem of sin, and we need also to be closer to God to be able to play this tune, as you were mentioning correctly. And there are religious attitudes, obviously, that show that we derive from a God that has created us with some clear intention, like the reason why we, for example, may be able to do sacrifices for people we don't even know, or travel the whole world to become missionaries, or tithe, or keep the Sabbath holy. All of these are religious attitudes which are a sign that there is a God and that there is a spiritual man within each one of us.
That's beautiful. In Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, there's a statement Paul says that since the creation of the world, his or God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have clearly been seen, being understood by what has been made, and that which is known about God is evident within each of us. In other words, through creation and within our own hearts, like C.S. Lewis was saying, we find this evidence, a certain morality that God created in each person's heart. In that same text, the creation of the world and the attributes of God being seen in what he created. Robin, talk about this God hypothesis, this sort of touching on this metaphor in terms of just kind of a high-level scientific concept that came out of, was mentioned in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion.
There are a number of ways of looking at God from a scientific perspective, and there are a number of high-level scientists, Francis Collins, for example, who believe that there is enough evidence out there to really posit scientifically the existence of God. Now, how well that is brought out, how well that is defined is another issue. Lots of people obviously disagree with it. But there does seem to be a trend today, at least amongst some people, that it is possible to objectively prove the existence of something outside of our own cosmos. Something had to put the whole thing into motion.
What about this hurricane metaphor? Tell everybody in the audience what Fred Hoyle was talking about and how Dawkins jumped on that.
Yeah, Fred Hoyle put together the argument from the complexity of life, and he says that the complexity of the world we see around us is pretty much, the idea of it happening all at one time is pretty much similar to a hurricane going through a junkyard and putting together a 747 jumbo. And it's a lovely idea. There are some flaws in it, unfortunately. But Dawkins jumped on it because the problem is when you're looking at end results, things can look very complicated. But if you look at things in terms of one step at a time, it then actually becomes a much easier proposition. Whether it's a truth or not is another issue.
Well, didn't he?
That's the Hoyle.
I mean, didn't he jump on the idea saying basically that if humans are that complex, then what was his argument? That basically that means that by its very nature of complexity, that God has to be more complex than humans who are impossible already?
Yes. It seems very much a little bit like Aquinas's argument in some respects. But yes, that's his basic jumping on point.
And Helia, the argument, basically the logical argument against that from Alistair McGrath was sort of written to answer that argument. What was that argument? How did the Christian apologists come back and answer that?
Yes, so basically what Dawkins was saying is that since God is even more complex, he's even more improbable. Therefore, I've almost proved that God doesn't exist. But, well, I'm no scientist, but the way I look at it is a little bit that I'm very improbable. I mean, my life is very improbable. It's very improbable that we're talking here together. It's very improbable that the Earth can go around the sun every year without even a loss of a second in a millennium. All of that is very improbable, and yet we can observe it and we can see it. So Alistair McGrath, in his book, The Dawkins Delusion, is going to say, so the question is not so much whether God is probable, but whether God is actual and actually exists. And so, in fact, God is very complex, and he is the creator, and he needs nothing from us, and he's the one that gives us everything. And for that reason, it's outside our knowledge base, and we can only know God because he actually revealed himself to us through the Bible and ultimately through the perfect revelation of his Son. So, and not only that, but this God that is the creator is also a personal God seeking a relationship with each one of us. Like we can read in Acts 17, indeed he is not far from each one of us.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful, Helia. Now, after we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some of the historical evidence for the authenticity of the Bible that Christians believe in. Stay with us. We'll be right back. You're listening to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Welcome back. I'm Chris Lang, your host on Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. I'm here with my friends Helia and Robin from the campus of Newbold College near London, England. Welcome back, folks.
Thank you.
Now, we are starting to talk in this second half. We're talking about intelligent faith. This is part one of a two-part series. And for those of you who are watching on television or listening on the radio, come to our website at hopeonfire.org, and you can search by keywords and find this topic under the words intelligent faith, and you'll be able to find a list of resources for further study in this area, because we're not going to be able to cover all of the landscape here, but we want to just touch some high-level things, and it's just great to share with you guys today. On the historical authenticity of the Bible, let's talk about the volume and accuracy of ancient manuscripts and archaeological findings that add to these bases of our faith. Helia, how many fragments and manuscripts can we find that are out there? And Robin, of course, feel free to pop in as well.
Yes, I mean, there are thousands of manuscripts for the New Testament. But I think the problem was very much with the Old Testament, because the most recent texts we had were the Masoretic texts that dated from the 9th century. And so round about the 18th century, scholars started to come in and criticize the authenticity of the Old Testament we had in our hands, saying that it would have been modified beyond belief. And so the only arguments that Jewish and Christian scholars had was to say, oh no, but the people that used to copy it by hand were very meticulous and they had very accurate copying pages and so on. But it was a weak argument. So there was something extraordinary that happened in 1947, and that was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And with that discovery, just someone that threw a stone into one cave looking for a stray goat, we found, I think there were 35,000 of fragments, and 40% of the documents that were found were actually Old Testament texts.
Wow.
So we were able to find almost 2,000-year-old manuscripts of practically the whole of the Old Testament, except perhaps for the Book of Esther. And so then the question is, well, let's see how close they are to the Masoretic texts. And in fact, apart from some little differences, the texts are mainly the same. And I think that was a great discovery, and it shows also God's providence.
Well, you know, I want to hear a little bit about some of the archaeological finds as well, but one of the things from the Dead Sea Scrolls that is most encouraging to me as well is the find of the book of Daniel in those writings, in terms of the the big argument over the prophetic power or the supernatural foreknowledge of God. There were many skeptics who claimed that Daniel couldn't have been written when it was claimed to have been written, right? 5 or 6 centuries before Christ, as Daniel writes in that book. And yet, here in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of those scrolls or fragments were dated 125 or 100 BC before Christ, which doesn't that indicate that there was an original long before those fragments could have been written, just because of the tradition of the Jewish tradition, that they couldn't become part of what was considered a Jewish Bible or Hebrew Bible?
Yes.
So to me, I mean, Daniel 2 shows us an image of the history of the world to the end of time, and so that just gives me a lot of faith in my mind. What about some other archaeological finds, Robin?
Well, there are a number of archaeological finds over the years that have been posited as being proof of biblical authenticity. Some of them, I believe, are a little bit dubious. They may mention names that are familiar to Old Testament readers, but it doesn't necessarily quite mean it's exactly the same person who we would talk about. For example, there was something about King David some time ago. It could have been King David. It also could mean something else. And I think this is a very important thing, is that sometimes the evidence is very, very old. And we have to be careful when we do look at archaeological finds that we're not just reading what we want to see in it, but it is actually what we think it is. There are a fair number of archaeological things which are more or less established without a doubt as referring to biblical events or people in the Bible. These are not fairy tales made up by Bronze Age nomads, as it's often been termed. There are actual real events, and there are real artifacts left over from this. And I think there is a fair amount that we can look on and sort of realize that this isn't just something made up by people. These are not just myths, another common accusation leveled at the Bible. These aren't things made up. These are actually referring to real people in real space and time. I think that's very important.
In researching for this program, I was astounded by some of the testimony of some of the archaeologists, if I can say that correctly, themselves who made some incredible statements. William Albright says there's no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. And another archaeologist, Nelson Gluck, adds, as a matter of fact, he says, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. In other words, they never found anything that proved some story never, some place was never there or never happened, right? So that's powerful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Helia, what are some of the actual specific finds that have been made that you can think of that you could share?
I think there was, for example, one not too long ago about someone in the army of Nebuchadnezzar. One of the names that was mentioned, I think it was actually one of the pieces in the British Museum, and someone working on it all of a sudden stumbles upon a name that he had seen in the Bible before. So I think these things are still happening as we talk, and that is really fascinating. So there may be a lot more to come. And just about the book of Daniel, as you were mentioning, yes, now they say that even if we don't accept that the book is as old as the 4th and 5th century, if we just stay around 150 BC or so, it still shows Daniel 2 is still amazing because it foretells the fall of the Roman Empire, the way it's going to be divided, and the fact that there would not be another empire of the same size that would cover the earth, etc., until the rock would come to establish the kingdom forever. So there's still a lot of amazing things for us to discover, and I also believe that archaeology, science, all disciplines will contribute to help us secure our faith.
We have a few minutes left. Let's talk about the evidence of miracles. Now, the Bible tells us that signs and wonders would occur in the lives of those who profess faith in Jesus. Tell me, from a personal standpoint, either of you, do you have experienced personal miracles in your lives or lives of people that you know?
Yes, I can give some. I don't know how much time you've got. It really depends.
All right. We got a couple minutes.
You got a couple of minutes. Well, I know definitely from my parents' side. My parents are missionaries. They're recently retired, but they came home, often would come home with bucket loads of miracles that would take place. The most interesting one I can think of, which I think was actually put out in one of the ADRA DVDs, was a young woman who had caught HIV. And she went back and had 3 or 4 tests. They all told her she had HIV until somebody in the village pointed her out towards a pastor, I think, who was living there. This was in Cambodia. And she went down and sort of talked to him. And I think she started praying, or they started praying for her. And she went back about 6 months later, I think it was, to another test. And the doctor said, well, your HIV has all disappeared. Now, this doesn't mean that every person who prays is going to have their HIV cured. But for this woman, it was a cure, and she's now teaching and telling everybody about God, because as far as she's concerned, this God who she never knew before has come along and cured her of HIV. Not all miracles are going to be that grand.
Right.
But sometimes they happen.
Helia, 1 minute left. Do you have something you want to share with the audience?
Okay, well, perhaps, sorry to be personal, but I think a miracle I see every day is my husband, in the sense that when we first met, he was more like an atheist or an agnostic, and he certainly did not believe in creation. And as we started to talk, he found my religious beliefs very cute, very interesting, but he had a shock when he realized that I believed in creation. And I remember he even told me once, whatever you do, please don't tell our friends that you're a creationist. And it was a slow miracle. It was not an instantaneous miracle, but after many years of study and research and discussions with many people, today is creationist Christian, and he's just recently decided also to change his career in a way that he can have more time to tell others about his beliefs in creation and tell others the story of creation and redemption.
Well, thank you all very much for joining me today. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My first experience in miracles began when my mother had a miscarriage. What she didn't know at the time was that she had twins. I was the other twin inside her womb. Now, there was no ultrasound during those days, and she continued having discomfort and bleeding. So her doctor performed a D&C. A D&C is a procedure where the doctor dilates the cervix and then inserts a long instrument with a sharp blade at the end, that's called a curette, to clean out the walls of the uterus. At that time, I was about 7 weeks old in the womb and about 1.5 inches long. An average uterus is only 3 inches long, which means there was nowhere to hide. It's simply impossible that I should be alive today. Psalm 139, verse 13 says, "You covered me in my mother's womb." Now you ask me to prove the existence of God? I don't have to. He made himself known to me long before I ever saw the light of day. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time.
Hope on Fire is produced by Livestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860, or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.